Welcome back to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, and today we're diving deep into the manipulative world of gaslighting. Often subtle and insidious, gaslighting is a psychological tactic used to gain power by making victims doubt their reality. This manipulation isn't just confined to personal relationships, but sprawls across our work environments, political arenas, and even infiltrates mainstream media. We'll dissect how gaslighting works, its psychological impact, and why it's such a powerful tool in controlling and misleading individuals or masses. This episode is going to be a bit longer than usual. There's just so much to unpack when it comes to gaslighting, so you might want to kick it up to 2x. We'll be exploring various contexts where gaslighting occurs, from intimate relationships to the global stage, and we'll be diving into some fascinating research along the way. So get comfortable, and let's embark on this journey to understand and combat gaslighting. Let's begin by understanding what gaslighting really is. The term gaslighting actually comes from a 1938 play and later 1944 film called Gaslight. In the story, a husband manipulates small elements of his wife's environment, including dimming the gas lights, and then denies that any changes occurred, slowly driving her to question her sanity. Since that time, gaslight has become a widely recognized psychological tactic. Gaslighting involves denying a victim's experience, contradicting facts, and often lying to make the victim question their judgment and their sanity. It's a form of emotional abuse that involves manipulation and psychological control. A study by Stern and colleagues published in 2021 found that gaslighting can lead to severe psychological distress and erode the victim's sense of reality and self-esteem. What's particularly interesting about gaslighting is how it exploits fundamental aspects of human psychology. Our brains are wired to seek consistency and understanding in our environments. When someone we trust repeatedly contradicts our perceptions, it creates cognitive dissonance, and this can be so distressing. That dissonance is at the heart of why gaslighting is so effective and so damaging. Another fascinating study by Sweet in 2019 explored how gaslighting operates as a form of social control. Sweet found that gaslighters exploit societal expectations about gender, sexuality, and other identities to manipulate their victims. For example, a gaslighter might use gender stereotypes to dismiss a woman's concerns as overly emotional, or leverage racial stereotypes to undermine a person of color's experience of discrimination. This shows how deeply ingrained gaslighting can be in our social structures. It's not just an individual psychological tactic, but one that's often reinforced by broader social narratives and power dynamics. This makes it all the more important for us to recognize and address gaslighting, not just on a personal level, but as a systemic issue. What are some of the psychological mechanisms at play in gaslighting? Dr. Robin Stern, in her book The Gaslight Effect, identifies several stages that victims of gaslighting often go through. These include disbelief, defense, and depression. In the disbelief stage, victims are confused by the gaslighter's behavior but try to rationalize it. In the defense stage, they start to push back against the gaslighter's claim. Finally, in the depression stage, they might start to accept the gaslighter's distorted reality, leading to a loss of self-esteem and confidence. Understanding these stages can be useful for both recognizing when you're being gaslit and for helping others who might be victims of this manipulation. It's important to note that gaslighting doesn't always follow a linear progression, and different individuals may experience these stages in different ways or to different degrees. How does gaslighting manifest in intimate relationships and family settings? It can be profoundly destructive, leading victims to doubt their own reality and their sanity. The manipulation often starts subtly, maybe with dismissals of the victim's feelings as overreactions, progressing to outright denials of events that actually occurred. For instance, you might hear phrases like, "You're remembering it wrong," or "You're too sensitive." These seemingly innocuous statements can lead to confusion and self-doubt in the victim. Over time, these small manipulations can snowball into a complete erosion of the victim's self-confidence and their ability to trust their own perceptions. A landmark study by Jacobson and Gottman back in 1998 highlighted how emotional manipulation, including gaslighting, can undermine relationships, leading to long-term psychological effects. They found that the tactics used are often subtle and may involve questioning the victim's memory, isolating them from sources of support, and trivializing their feelings. Breaking that down a bit further, in a romantic relationship, gaslighting might look like a partner consistently denying their infidelity, even when presented with hard evidence. They might say things like, "You're crazy for thinking that," or "You're just paranoid because of your past relationships." Over time, the victim might start to believe that they're indeed paranoid or even unreasonable, even in the face of clear evidence to the contrary. We've heard countless stories from relationship therapists about how gaslighting can escalate from simple misunderstandings to systemic psychological abuse. One therapist described a case where a partner persistently invalidated the other's concerns about fidelity and financial decisions, only to later reveal their deception, leaving the victim in a state of self-doubt and confusion that lasted for years. Dr. Simon, a clinical psychologist specializing in manipulation tactics, points out that gaslighting in relationships often involves a pattern of idealize, devalue, and discard. The gaslighter might initially put their partner on a pedestal, and then gradually begin to undermine their confidence, and finally discard them emotionally or physically when they no longer serve the gaslighter's needs. It's not just romantic relationships either. Parental gaslighting is a serious issue that can have long-lasting effects. A study published in 2018 by Callahan and colleagues showed that children who are repeatedly told their perceptions are wrong may develop severe anxiety and identity issues. These often carry into adulthood, affecting their ability to trust their own judgments in all types of relationships and putting them at risk. For example, a parent might consistently deny or downplay a child's experience and emotion. They might say things like, "You weren't really scared, you're just being dramatic," or "That didn't happen, you must have dreamed it." This kind of invalidation can lead to children doubting their own emotions and experiences well into adulthood. Another study by Baker and Ben-Ami, published in 2011, found that adults who experience parental alienation, a form of gaslighting in which one parent turns a child against the other parent, reported higher rates of depression, substance abuse, and difficulty forming healthy relationships later in life. It's also worth noting that gaslighting can occur in friendships and other familiar relationships. Sibling relationships, for instance, can be breeding grounds for gaslighting behavior, especially if parents inadvertently reinforce it by dismissing one child's complaints about another child's behavior. The long-term effects of relationship gaslighting can be severe. Victims often report symptoms similar to those of PTSD, including hypervigilance, difficulty concentrating, and emotional numbness. A study by Hightower found that survivors of relationship gaslighting often struggle trusting new partners and may have difficulty setting healthy boundaries in future relationships in their personal lives and at work. Speaking of work, the workplace is another common arena for gaslighting, particularly by toxic bosses and colleagues. A toxic workplace often thrives on gaslighting techniques to maintain control over employees. This can range from bosses denying conversations that took place to shifting goalposts without notice, which leads employees to question their professional competence in reality. What might this look like in a typical office setting? Imagine you've just finished a project that your boss assigned to you. You're proud of your work, and you submitted it on time. But when you meet with your boss to review it, they claim they never asked for that project at all. They insist you've wasted company time on something unnecessary, leaving you confused and doubting your own memory of the assignment. Or consider a scenario where a colleague takes credit for your ideas in a meeting. When you confront them later, they deny it ever happened and suggest you must have misunderstood the conversation. Over time, these experiences can make you question your own competence and even your sanity. I've seen real-world examples from my corporate training session that show how recognizing these patterns can empower employees. By seeking clarity and maintaining records, employees can mitigate some of the gaslighter's power. For instance, following up on your verbal conversations with email summaries can create a paper trail that makes it harder for gaslighters to deny or distort past interactions. There's some fascinating academic research on this topic. A study in 2018 by Basford and Offerman discussed the long-term impact of workplace gaslighting. They linked it to decreased job satisfaction and increased turnover. The researchers suggest that companies need to foster transparent communication to build trust among employees and discourage manipulative tactics. Another important study by Luck and Sandvik in 2006 confirmed that such psychological tactics can create a hostile work environment, leading to mental health issues and high turnover. Victims often feel powerless and are left questioning their skills and their worth. Looking deeper into the organizational dynamics that allow workplace gaslighting to flourish, it's often tied to power imbalance and organizational culture. A study by Tepper et al. In 2017 found that abusive supervision, which can include gaslighting behaviors, is more likely to occur in organizations with highly centralized power structures and low accountability for leaders. This workplace gaslighting can take many forms. It might involve denying or distorting information, where a manager might tell an employee they never sent an important email, even when the employee can clearly see it in their inbox. Dribbling emotions or concerns, when an employee raises a legitimate concern about workload or deadlines, and they're told they're just not handling stress well, or that they're too sensitive. There's also blame shifting. A gaslighting colleague might consistently blame others for their mistakes, making their victims doubt their own competence. There's also withholding information. By deliberately keeping employees in the dark about important information, gaslighters can maintain control and make their victims feel incompetent. Using organizational policies as weapons. These gaslighters might manipulate company policies to their advantage and then deny any wrongdoing when confronted. The effects of this workplace gaslighting can be devastating. A study by Sakas and Laksham in 2017 found that employees who experienced gaslighting at work reported higher levels of anxiety, depression, and physical health problems compared to those who didn't. Additionally, workplace gaslighting doesn't just impact individuals. It can poison entire organizational structures and cultures. When gaslighting becomes normalized, it can lead to a culture of fear, of distrust, and overall reduced productivity, harming the company. A study by Eisenberger found that perceived organizational support, often eroded by gaslighting behaviors, is strongly linked to employee performance and commitment. So what can organizations do to combat workplace gaslighting? Some strategies I suggest include implementing clear communication protocols, providing training on recognizing and addressing gaslighting behavior, creating safe channels for reporting abusive behavior, fostering a culture of transparency and accountability, and regularly assessing employee well-being and the organizational climate. By addressing gaslighting head-on, organizations can create healthier, more productive work environments where employees feel valued and trusted. What about politics and public messaging? Politically, gaslighting is used to manipulate public opinion fairly consistently. It involves leaders or parties insisting that harmful policies are for the common good or blatantly denying or manipulating facts. This tactic undermines trust in our institutions and our media, fostering a society where truth becomes a matter of opinion. We're experiencing the repercussions of this on a large scale now here in the United States. Political gaslighting is particularly insidious because it operates on a massive scale, potentially affecting millions of people simultaneously. We often see politicians engage in gaslighting by denying factual events or statements that they'd previously made, even when there is clear evidence to the contrary. A politician may claim they never supported a particular policy, despite video or voting evidence showing them advocating for it, leading the public to question their own memory or the veracity of the evidence. There's also manipulation of voter perceptions. During election campaigns, political ads might manipulate facts about an opponent's stance or actions, portraying them in a misleading way to create doubt among their voters. For example, an ad might selectively edit a speech to make it appear as if the opponent supports a widely unpopular measure, when in fact they do not. Politicians might label unfavorable news coverage as fake news, even when the reporting is accurate. This tactic aims to discredit legitimate journalism and make people doubt reputable sources of information. Both of these two tactics are going to get much worse as AI becomes more prevalent. There's also Historical revisionism. Some political figures attempt to rewrite or downplay historical events to suit their narrative. This can involve denying or minimizing past atrocities or exaggerating past successes. Lastly, there's scapegoating. Politicians might blame societal problems on particular groups, deflecting attention from more complex systemic issues or from their own shortcomings. A study by Sander van der Linden discussed how political gaslighting can lead to widespread public confusion and apathy. Constant contradictory messages can cause people to disengage from political discourse altogether. This disengagement is particularly dangerous in democratic societies where an informed and engaged citizenry is necessary for holding leaders accountable. Another study, by Lewandowski et al., explored the persistence of misinformation in society. They found that once misinformation has been accepted, it's incredibly difficult to correct, even in the face of clear retractions. This continued influence effect helps explain why political gaslighting can be so effective and so long-lasting. Recent political campaigns have utilized gaslighting by contradicting verifiable facts, then accusing the media or opposition of spreading fake news. This tactic is analyzed in political psychology journals, which illustrate how these methods undermine democratic processes by eroding trust in our institutions and media. But political gaslighting isn't just about elections. It's also used in ongoing governance. For example, a government might insist that a clearly harmful policy like dropping pandemic protections is actually beneficial to the public. They might cherry-pick data, use misleading statistics, or appeal to emotion rather than facts to support their claims. Over time, this can lead to a populace that's not sure what to believe, making them susceptible to further manipulation, to conspiracy theory, and to danger. What about gaslighting in public messaging and advertising? This is a place where things get really interesting because it's not just politicians who engage in these tactics. Corporations and interest groups also use similar strategies to shape public opinion and behavior. For example, many corporations engage in greenwashing tactics. They heavily advertise and promote their small recycling initiatives or an eco-friendly product while simultaneously engaging in practices that have significant environmental impact. This can mislead consumers into thinking that their individual actions, like recycling a single plastic bottle, are enough to offset the broader environmental damage caused by these corporations. A study by Freitas Neto et al. Analyzed 500 green claims made by companies in various sectors. They found that 42% of these claims were exaggerated, vague, or deceptive. This kind of messaging can gaslight consumers into believing they're making environmentally responsible choices when the reality is far more complex. Similarly, mainstream media and advertisement sometimes present recycling as a panacea for all waste problems, neglecting the complexities and limitations of current recycling technologies and systems. It might promote the recyclability of certain types of plastics that, in reality, are rarely recycled due to economic and technical constraints. This can create a false sense of security among the public, leading them to believe that as long as they recycle, they're not contributing to environmental degradation. These examples illustrate how gaslighting in the context of public messaging can manipulate perception, making individuals feel overly responsible for large-scale issues, while the larger and more impactful industrial practices remain inadequately addressed. This misdirection serves to protect corporate interest and maintain the status quo by minimizing public demand for more substantial regulation and reform. Mainstream media, whether knowingly or not, can also perpetuate gaslighting by presenting biased information as balanced, which can confuse and mislead the public. Let's look at some examples from across different media. We already covered the 1944 film Gaslight, but a more recent example is the 2014 thriller Gone Girl, where a character uses elaborate schemes to make it appear as though her husband is abusive and murderous, leading others to question his innocence and sanity. This film showcases how gaslighting can be used not just in intimate relationships, but also to manipulate public perception on a larger scale. On television, we see examples in popular shows like Breaking Bad, where Walter White gaslights his wife Skyler about his criminal activities, making her doubt her suspicions. He consistently lies about his whereabouts and the source of his newfound wealth, causing Skylar to question her own judgment and sanity. In Mad Men, Don Draper often dismisses his wife Betty's concerns about his mysterious past and his infidelities, leading her to doubt her perceptions. This portrayal highlights how gaslighting can be used to maintain power dynamics in relationships and cover up deceit. These fictional media portrayals are important because they help audiences recognize gaslighting behaviors in real life. However, they can also inadvertently normalize these behaviors if they are not critically examined, which is why the study of media literacy is so important. Even in advertising, we see gaslighting tactics. Beauty and health product ads often suggest that normal physical characteristics like body hair or wrinkles are problems that need to be fixed, making individuals question their self-image. This form of gaslighting plays on insecurities and societal expectations to create a perceived need for products. Diet industry ads promote unrealistic body standards and suggest that if you're not losing weight, you're not trying hard enough, implying that the issue is with the individual's effort rather than the efficacy of the product or genetics. This shifts blame onto the consumer, gaslights them into believing that their failure is due to personal shortcomings rather than unrealistic expectations, ineffective products, or things that are outside of their control. What about the news media? While journalistic ethics call for balanced and factual reporting, the reality is often more complex. A study by Lazare and colleagues examined the spread of true and false news online. They found that false news spreads more rapidly and more widely than truth, in part due to human behavior. This kind of environment can make it easier for gaslighting tactics to take hold in the media. For example, misrepresentation of science or health information is a form of gaslighting that can have serious consequences. Mainstream news outlets sometimes present scientific findings in a way that's not entirely accurate, such as overstating the implications of a preliminary study on health. This can mislead the public into doubting well-established scientific consensus on issues like climate change or the fact that masks work well to prevent viral spread or that vaccines are safe. Coverage of economic issues also can involve gaslighting tactics. Economic news can sometimes be presented in a way that blames individuals for macroeconomic problems. For example, news segments that suggest personal spending habits are solely to blame for economic hardship, ignoring larger systemic issues, can make viewers doubt whether broader economic policies or conditions are at fault. Media studies scholars argue for stronger ethical standards in journalism to combat gaslighting, emphasizing the need for clear distinctions between opinion and fact-based reporting, and advocate for media literacy education to help the public identify and critique gaslighting tactics in news outlets. The work on agenda setting theory by McCombs and Shaw showed that media plays a large role in shaping what people think is important. When combined with gaslighting tactics, this power can manipulate and control public opinion on a large scale, often going unchecked due to the perceived authority of news sources. A more recent study by Voss and Thomas examined how social media has complicated the traditional agenda-setting role of mainstream media. They found that while social media can provide alternative narratives, it can also amplify misinformation and gaslighting tactics, creating echo chambers in certain cases that reinforce beliefs regardless of their factual basis. More recently, we found that social media, especially platforms such as TikTok, Telegram, and Snap, can circumvent common media and political gaslighting tactics, providing a necessary real-time feed of actual footage of events, making it difficult for media to spin a narrative. Media gaslighting isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's a byproduct of time constraints, lack of in-depth knowledge on a complex topic, or the pressure to simplify issues for a general audience. However, the effect on the public can be the same: confusion, self-doubt, and a distorted perception of reality. To combat media gaslighting, I recommend diversifying your news sources and seek out primary sources where possible, and even broaden your sources to international sources where possible so you can be sure that you are getting viewpoints that are not strictly from the country where you live. Being aware of your own bias and how it might affect interpretation of the news. Fact-checking claims, especially those that seem sensational or are too good to be true. understanding the difference between news and opinion pieces, and supporting journalism that prioritizes accuracy over speed. By being aware of these tactics and actively engaging in critical media consumption, we can all better protect ourselves from gaslighting in the media landscape. Gaslighting isn't just a harmful interpersonal tactic or a strategy in the media or politics. It's also sometimes intertwined with certain mental health conditions, both as a symptom and as a potential trigger for psychological distress. Let's take a look at the psychological impact of gaslighting and some of the research in this area. Research has identified patterns of gaslighting in relationships where one partner may suffer from a personality disorder, in particular narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, and borderline personality disorder, or BPD. A study by Miano and colleagues found that individuals with NPD may use gaslighting to maintain a sense of superiority and a sense of control, undermining their partner's perception of reality to align more with their own narcissistic needs. It's important to note that not all individuals with these disorders engage in gaslighting, and not all gaslighters have a personality disorder. However, understanding the connection can help us recognize patterns of behavior and help people seek appropriate help when it's necessary. Gaslighting can also lead to severe psychological effects on the victims, contributing to anxiety, depression, and even PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. A study by Evans in 2021 explored how victims of chronic gaslighting can experience long-term emotional and cognitive disturbances, including confusion, loss of confidence, and an impaired ability to trust their own memory or their own judgment. What are some of the specific mental health impacts of gaslighting, you ask? Victims of gaslighting often experience heightened anxiety. They might constantly second-guess themselves, worry about making mistakes, or fear confrontation. A study in 2017 found that survivors of relationship gaslighting often struggle with generalized anxiety disorder long after the relationship is ended. The constant self-doubt and erosion of self-esteem caused by gaslighting can lead to depression. Victims may feel hopeless, worthless, or unable to make decisions for themselves. Research by Stern found a strong correlation between experiencing gaslighting and developing depression. In severe cases, gaslighting can lead to symptoms of PTSD. Victims may experience flashbacks, nightmares, or hypervigilance. A study by Johnson et al. In 2020 found that individuals who experienced prolonged gaslighting in intimate relationships showed PTSD symptoms similar to those seen in combat veterans. Gaslighting creates a state of cognitive dissonance where victims struggle to reconcile their own perceptions with the false reality presented by the gaslighter. This can lead to confusion, indecisiveness, or a feeling of losing one's mind. Over time, victims of gaslighting may develop learned helplessness, a psychological condition where a person believes they have no control over their situation and stops trying to change it, even when opportunities for change become available. Another important study by Stark and Hester in 2019 highlighted how gaslighting can be a form of coercive control in abusive relationships, leading to severe psychological harm and isolation of the victim. They found that gaslighting often co-occurs with other forms of abuse, compounding its harmful effects. The effects of gaslighting can persist long after the abusive relationship or situation has ended. A longitudinal study by Thompson and Kaplan found that individuals who experienced gaslighting showed impaired decision-making abilities and difficulty in forming trusting relationships years after the gaslighting had stopped. However, it's not all doom and gloom. Recovery from gaslighting is possible with the right support and interventions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, has been shown in some cases to be effective in helping victims of gaslighting rebuild their sense of reality and self-worth. A study by Chen et al. Found that CBT combined with mindfulness techniques significantly reduced symptoms of anxiety and depression in survivors of psychological abuse, including gaslighting. One caveat: CBT can be detrimental to autistics and other groups, so if you are autistic, you might want to try other forms of therapy to get over being gaslit. Support groups can also play a vital role in recovery. Sharing experiences with others who have gone through similar situations can help validate one's experiences and break the isolation that gaslighting often creates. A study by Roberts et al. Found that participation in support groups significantly improved self-esteem, reduced PTSD symptoms in survivors of emotional abuse. A study by Roberts et al. Found that participation in support groups significantly improved self-esteem and reduced PTSD symptoms in survivors of emotional abuse. It's also worth noting that gaslighting doesn't just affect the direct victim. Witnessing gaslighting, especially in familial settings, can have profound effects on children and other family members. A study by Baker in 2016 found that children who witnessed parental gaslighting were more likely to develop anxiety disorders and have difficulty forming more secure attachments in adulthood. A study by Baker in 2016 found that children who witnessed parental gaslighting were more likely to develop anxiety disorders and have difficulty forming secure attachments in adulthood. As mental health professionals, it's critical that we're aware of the signs of gaslighting and its psychological impacts. This awareness allows us to provide more targeted and effective interventions for those who have experienced this form of psychological abuse. Tragically, this cycle of abuse can perpetuate itself, turning victims into perpetrators. In environments where gaslighting is normalized, such as in certain toxic workplaces or abusive familial settings, individuals might adopt these manipulative behaviors as a survival strategy. This adaptive behavior is often a response to prolonged exposure to manipulation, where adopting the abuser's tactics may seem like the only way to regain control or stability in a chaotic environment. Exploring this cycle in more depth, we find learned behavior. Psychological research highlights that individuals who have been gaslit may subconsciously mimic these behaviors in other relationships, not necessarily out of malice, but as a learned mechanism of interacting. A study by Smith and Freed found that such behaviors can be unlearned through targeted therapy and interventions, which focus on understanding and processing the abuse, learning healthy communication skills, and rebuilding trust in their perceptions and relationships. We also find intergenerational transmission. Another important study by Calvet and colleagues found that children who experience psychological abuse, including gaslighting, are more likely to engage in similar behaviors in their own relationships as adults. This underscores the importance of early intervention and breaking the cycle of abuse. There's also workplace dynamics. In professional settings, employees who have been gaslit by superiors might adopt these tactics when they themselves reach positions of power. A study by Tepper et al. Found that individuals who experienced abusive supervision were more likely to engage in similar behaviors when they became supervisors, perpetuating toxic work culture. There's also coping mechanisms. For some individuals, engaging in gaslighting behaviors becomes a defense, a defensive mechanism. Having experienced the powerlessness of being gaslit, they may resort to these tactics to avoid feeling vulnerable again. A study by Becker, Blees, and Freed explored how trauma survivors sometimes adopt manipulative behaviors as a way to regain a sense of control over their environment. And also, normalization of abuse. In some cases, victims may come to see gaslighting as a normal part of relationships. A study by Stark found that individuals who grew up in households where gaslighting was common were more likely to both tolerate and perpetrate these behaviors in their adult relationships. It's important to know that these cycles are not inevitable. With awareness, with support, and with appropriate interventions, the cycle can be broken. Here are some strategies that we've shown to be effective in breaking the cycle. Again, there's therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy and trauma-focused therapies have been shown to be effective in helping individuals recognize and change maladaptive behaviors. A study by Johnson et al. Found that CBT significantly reduced the likelihood of abuse survivors perpetrating similar behavior. Again, this is with a caveat: if you are autistic or that type of neurotype, you might want to explore other types of therapy or perhaps EMDR. Education also helps. Awareness and education about healthy relationship dynamics can play a big role. A study by Fauci et al. Found that school-based programs teaching about healthy relationships significantly reduced the incidence of dating violence and gaslighting among adolescents. There's also support groups. Peer support can be invaluable to breaking the cycle. A study by Lang found that participation in support groups for abuse survivors reduced the likelihood of engaging in abusive behaviors by providing alternative models of interaction and mutual support. There's also mindfulness practices. Mindfulness and emotional regulation techniques can help individuals become more aware of their behaviors and their triggers. A study by Ortiz and Kempner found that mindfulness-based intervention reduced reactive aggression in individuals with a history of experiencing abuse. And lastly, there's systemic interventions. Addressing gaslighting at a systemic level, such as through workplace policies, community education programs, or media literacy, can help create environments that don't tolerate or perpetuate these behaviors. A study by Rayner and Lewis found that organizations with clear anti-bullying policies and procedures had lower rates of workplace psychological abuse. It's important to note that while understanding the cycle can help us approach the issue with more empathy, it doesn't excuse abusive behavior. The goal is to break the cycle, not perpetuate it. As a society, we need to create environments where gaslighting is recognized, called out, addressed, and prevented. So what does it mean to recognize, address, and prevent gaslighting? Well, recognizing as the first step involves awareness, education, and support from trusted individuals that can help victims validate the reality and begin to heal. Psychological professionals recommend setting boundaries, seeking therapy, and in some cases, removing yourself from the gaslighting environment. What does that mean, though? Well, recognition and awareness is the first step in combating gaslighting. This can be challenging because gaslighting is often subtle and insidious. Empirical research like that by Gillig and colleagues suggests that support groups and therapy are effective in helping individuals rebuild their confidence, but you also need your teammates to acknowledge it's happening at work, your siblings to acknowledge that it's happening in your family, your friends and colleagues to acknowledge that it's happening in the larger media. That recognition is essential. Psychologists recommend maintaining personal diaries and records of interactions to help validate your experience and your perceptions. This practice, known as journaling, has been shown to be therapeutic in numerous studies. For example, a study by Ulrich and Luttgendorf found that expressive writing about traumatic events can lead to improved psychological and physical health outcomes. We talked about CBT earlier, and I mentioned that it doesn't help everyone. It's good for most people, but there are some groups that really don't benefit from it. So what else can you use? There's also dialectical behavior therapy to help fight the effects of gaslighting, which is more focused on mindfulness, interpersonal effectiveness, and emotional regulation skills. I mentioned EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This can be effective in processing traumatic memories that are associated with gaslighting. Talk therapy may not work for some people. There's certain medications that can help with anxiety and depression associated with gaslighting. You can learn to set healthy boundaries. That's really difficult for most people because a boundary is really controlling your own behavior, not someone else's, right? So you have to be willing to reinforce it by doing what you said you were going to do if the gaslighting happens again. Maybe that involves walking away from a family member or changing a job. So that can be challenging, but definitely recommend working on boundaries. And then there's just education and prevention. You can go with educational programs aimed at boosting your emotional intelligence and your critical thinking skills so that you have the tools you need to combat gaslighting on an individual and societal level. A study by Wolf et al. Found that school-based programs teaching about healthy relationships significantly reduced dating violence and other violence and improved relationship skills among adolescents overall. We've talked about workplace interventions as well, which can be a little harder since an employee is not always in control of that. But a study by Anderson et al. Found that organizations with well-implemented anti-bullying policies had lower rates of workplace psychological abuse. What does well-implemented mean? It means that there are real consequences for bullying, not just filing a report with HR and having it ignored or worse, reported to your manager. There are training programs for managers and employees on recognizing and addressing gaslighting behaviors, and those can also be effective. A study by Georgi et al. Found that leadership training programs that include modules on psychological safety can significantly reduce reports of workplace bullying and improve overall job satisfaction. Talked a bit about media literacy. Given the role that media can play in perpetuating gaslighting on a societal level, media literacy education is important. A study by Zhang et al. Found that Media literacy education significantly improved students' ability to critically analyze media messages and resist manipulation tactics such as gaslighting. There's legal and policy interventions. On a broader societal level, legal and policy interventions can play a role in combating gaslighting. For example, the recognition of coercive control as a form of domestic abuse in some jurisdictions has helped to address more subtle forms of psychological abuse in relationships, including gaslighting. A study by Stark and Hester found that these legal changes have impacted responses to domestic abuse positively. There's also technology-based solutions. In the digital age that we live in, technology can play a role in combating gaslighting as well. For instance, apps that allow for secure documentation of abusive behavior provide valuable evidence for victims' claims. A study by Glass et al. Found that safety decision aid apps can be effective in helping survivors of intimate partner violence, including those experiencing gaslighting, to assess their situation accurately and access help. And finally, there's community-based interventions. These can be powerful in combating gaslighting. A study by Goodman and Smith in 2011 found that community-based advocacy programs that provide emotional support, safety planning, and access to resources can significantly improve outcomes for survivors of abuse, including those who have experienced gaslighting. As we wrap up today's episode on gaslighting, it's clear that this manipulative tactic can have profound psychological effects. Gaslighting is a pervasive issue that affects so many areas of our lives. By shining a light on this manipulation tactic, we empower ourselves to recognize, resist, and rectify its impacts. Whether in our personal lives, our workplaces, or the broader societal discourse, understanding the psychology of gaslighting helps us foster healthier, more authentic interactions. By staying informed and vigilant, we can protect ourselves and support others who may be victims of this insidious practice. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to maintaining our mental health and discerning truth from manipulation. The journey to combat gaslighting is ongoing, but with continued research, education, and support, we can create a society that's more resilient to these manipulative tactics. As individuals, we can work on building our self-trust and our critical thinking skills. As communities, we can foster environments of mutual respect and open communication. And as a society, we can push for policies and practices that discourage gaslighting and support those who have experienced it. Thank you for joining me on this exploration into gaslighting. I hope that you got valuable insights from this episode. I do have one announcement today, and that is that I am starting a Patreon to make it easier for people to find episodes. I have been uploading the back episodes to it. I've got about half of them uploaded. I will finish the rest this week, but you can find the Patreon at patreon.com/PsyberSpace. There is no monetary paywall to join. This is just a place for me to collect episodes, talk to you a bit more, get your comments and suggestions for topics, and build a community around this podcast. There is a donation box if you want to support the creation of it, but it is absolutely not required to enjoy these episodes. I do this because I am passionate about psychology, media psychology, organizational psychology, and the impact that it has on our world. This has been an episode of PsyberSpace, and I'm your host, Leslie Poston. Until next time, stay curious.